The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, carried by a dust-covered postal rider who had ridden 40 miles through the Arizona heat just to deliver it into the calloused hands of a woman who had been waiting for something, anything, to change the shape of her life. Matilda Brooks stood on the narrow porch of her father's farmhouse outside of Tucson, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, and she took the envelope with a careful kind of reverence, the way a person handles something they are afraid to open because the hope inside might shatter them. The return address read, Harlan Croft, Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory. She had written to Harlan Croft 3 weeks prior, responding to an advertisement in the Tucson Courier that read, Widower, 42, rancher of good standing, seeks capable woman for companionship and partnership. Honest work, honest life. Matilda was 24 years old, capable in every sense of the word and running low on options. Her father, Edmund Brooks, had passed the previous autumn from a chest infection that had taken him slowly and cruelly, and the farm was mortgaged to a man in Phoenix who had no patience for sentiment. She had a younger brother, Thomas, who was 16 and full of grief and bad ideas. She had a neighbor, Mrs. Clara Holt, who told her every Sunday after church that a woman alone was a woman in trouble. And she had herself, which she had always found to be enough until the weight of the world started pressing down in ways that felt less like inconvenience and more like emergency. So she had written to Harlan Croft. She had been careful and practical about it. She was not looking for poetry. She was looking for a life. She opened the letter on the porch. The handwriting was not what she expected. It was neat, almost schooled, slanted slightly to the right as if the writer leaned into his words. The ink was dark and deliberate. She had expected something functional, a list of expectations maybe, or a brief confirmation that he had received her letter and found her acceptable. Instead, what she read made her sit down slowly on the porch step, the flower still on her hands, the spring sun warm on her shoulders. The letter began, Miss Brooks, I must confess something to you before we go any further. You wrote to Harlan Croft. Harlan is my employer and my friend, and he asked me to look over his correspondence because his eyesight has been troubling him and he is too proud to admit it. I read your letter. I should have put it down after the first line. I read it 3 times instead. Matilda blinked. She read on. You wrote that you are not looking for romance, that you are practical and steady and you know how to work hard and ask little. You wrote that honestly and without embarrassment, and I found that more interesting than anything I have read in a long time. I should tell Harlan about your letter. I will tell Harlan about your letter. But first I am writing back to you as myself, not as his representative, because your honesty deserves honesty in return. My name is Roy Morgan. I am 30 years old. I am a ranch hand on Harlan's property, which means I have considerably less to offer than a rancher of good standing, but I have been told I write a decent letter. I do not know why I am writing this. I know I will send it anyway. Matilda sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She read it again, and then again. Roy Morgan had continued past that introduction. He had written about the land in New Mexico, about the way the sky turned colors at dusk that she would not believe unless she saw them, about how Redemption Creek was a small town that smelled like pine and iron and the river that ran along its southern edge. He wrote that Harlan was a good man, a fair employer, and genuinely in need of a wife who could help manage his household, because his own health was declining in ways he did not speak of openly. He wrote that he felt guilty for intercepting the correspondence even as he was doing it. He wrote that he had been on ranches and cattle trails since he was 17, and that he had never once written a personal letter to anyone, and he was not sure what had come over him. At the bottom, below his name, he had added a single line as a postscript. If you are cross with me for writing, you have every right to be. But if you are curious, write back. I will answer honestly. Matilda looked up from the letter at the flat, dry stretch of land her father had worked for 18 years. She looked at the empty barn with its broken hinge. She looked at Thomas sitting on the fence post down by the creek, whittling something out of pine the way he always did when he was sad and had nothing better to do. She went inside and sat down at the table and got out her writing materials. She wrote to Harlan Croft first. She was polite and precise. She explained that she had received a letter written on his behalf by a man named Roy Morgan, and she wished to know if the original advertisement still stood and if Harlan was still seeking correspondence. Then she took a second sheet of paper and she wrote to Roy Morgan. She wrote, "Mr. Morgan, I am not cross with you. I am something else entirely that I cannot quite name. You were right that I wrote that letter practically and without romance, and you were right that your honesty deserves the same. I am 24. I have run this farm since my father died last October. I can cook and sew and ride a horse better than most men I know, and I am not ashamed of any of it. I am also, if I am being as honest as you were, lonely in a way I do not often permit myself to acknowledge. You do not owe me anything." You intercepted a letter and wrote back, which is either the strangest or the kindest thing that has happened to me in a long time, possibly both. I am curious. Tell me about yourself. She sealed both letters, walked them to the postal station in town herself rather than waiting for the rider, and then she came home and tried not to think about it. She thought about it constantly. 3 weeks later, 2 letters arrived on the same day. The first was from Harlan Croft, written in a shaky hand that confirmed Roy's description of his failing eyesight. Harlan was courteous and formal. He had been told about Roy's letter, he said, and he did not hold it against either of them. He was still seeking a wife. He enclosed a brief description of his ranch and his expectations. He hoped she would consider coming to Redemption Creek to meet him properly. The second letter was from Roy Morgan. He wrote 5 pages. He wrote about growing up in Central Texas, the third son of a family that had too little land and too many mouths, how he had gone west at 17 with a bedroll and a borrowed horse, and found his way into cattle work, because it was the only work that would take him without references. He wrote about the years on trail drives, the kishiom and the good night loving, the dust and the cold nights, and the way a herd of longhorns sounded when they were quiet and settled, and the stars were out over the plain. He wrote about how he had come to New Mexico 6 years ago and found Harlan's ranch and found something that felt, for the first time, like a place he might stay. He wrote that he had never married, had come close once when he was 22 and a girl in Abilene had smiled at him a certain way, but that it had not come to anything and perhaps that had been for the best. He wrote about books. She had not expected that. He said there was a box of them in the bunkhouse that a previous hand had left behind, novels and histories, and one very battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that he had read 3 times out of boredom, and then a 4th time because they had started to mean something. He said he felt slightly embarrassed admitting that. He said he had a feeling she would not laugh at him. He was right. She did not laugh. She wrote back the same day she received his letter, which was not something she did, but she could not help it. She told him about her father, about the farm, about Thomas and his grief and his bad ideas. She told him about the mortgage and the man in Phoenix, and the way the walls of a house that used to be full of a person's life start to feel different when that person is gone. She told him she had read every book on the farm's one shelf twice, and that she had a particular fondness for novels even though her father had considered them a frivolity. She told him she had laughed when she should not have at the Shakespeare comment, not at him but in recognition, and that she hoped he understood the difference. She told him she was going to write to Harlan Croft and accept his offer to visit Redemption Creek. And then, at the bottom of the page, below her name, she wrote a postscript of her own. "I do not know what I am doing, Mr. Morgan, but I think I would like to keep writing to you regardless of what happens when I get there." The letters continued through April and into May of 1882, crossing each other in the post with a regularity that Matilda began to look forward to the way she looked forward to the first coffee of the morning. Roy wrote about the ranch, about the horses he was breaking that spring, about a particular bay gelding named General who had an opinion about everything, and made his feelings known with his ears. He wrote about the other hands, men named Cobb and Fredericks, and a quiet young man called Eli who was barely 19 and homesick from the moment he arrived. He wrote about the town of Redemption Creek, population roughly 300 souls, with a general store run by a woman named Mrs. Peavy who knew everything about everyone and was not shy about sharing it. Matilda wrote back about Thomas, who had agreed to go work for a neighboring family while she was away, which solved the immediate problem of leaving him unsupervised. She wrote about selling the farm, which had happened in mid-April with a quickness that was both a relief and a grief, because the man from Phoenix had been eager, and the price had been fair enough to give her something to start with. She wrote about packing her trunk, which was both practical and strangely emotional, deciding what a person took when they were leaving the only place they had ever known. She wrote that she was afraid. He wrote back immediately upon receiving that letter. Not a long response, shorter than his usual, but she read it more times than any other. He wrote, "Being afraid is not the same as being wrong to go. Sometimes afraid is just what forward feels like. I will be honest with you, Miss Brooks, since that seems to be what we do. I am hoping, when you arrive, that you will find Harlan Croft to be everything you hoped he would be. I am also, if I am being completely honest, hoping that you will walk off that stagecoach and the first thing you notice is not Harlan." He had not followed that line with anything else. He had simply signed his name. Matilda had read that line so many times the ink was slightly smudged where her finger kept tracing it. She departed Tucson on the 3rd day of June, 1882, on the stage that ran northeast toward Silver City and then the connecting route to Redemption Creek. Thomas came to see her off, taller than she remembered him looking, fighting to keep his chin steady the way 16-year-old boys do when they do not want anyone to see them cry. She held him by the shoulders and told him to work hard and eat properly and write to her, and he said he would, and she believed him because Thomas, for all his bad ideas, always meant what he said. The journey took 3 days, with stops at way stations where she slept on cots and ate whatever was available, which was usually beans and coffee, and something that might have been venison. The landscape changed around her as she traveled, the flat desert giving way to something rougher and more dramatic, mountains in the distance, the sky enormous and ancient-looking in the way it only got in country that had never been tamed. She thought about Harlan Croft. She thought about the advertisement and the sensible reasons she had responded to it. She thought about a man she had never seen who had a ranch and declining health and needed a capable woman. She thought about Roy Morgan considerably more, which she told herself was because she knew him better from the letters. That was true. It was not the complete truth. The stagecoach pulled into Redemption Creek at mid-morning on a Friday, kicking up a long tail of dust as it came down the main street. Matilda looked out the window at the town, taking it in. A wide dirt street, a row of storefronts, a saloon with a painted sign, a livery stable, a church with a white steeple that needed painting. It was small and sun-baked and very real, and it smelled like pine and iron and the river, exactly as Roy had described it. There was a group of people at the stage stop. A woman she would later learn was Mrs. Peavy, a man in a suit who handled the mail, 2 cowboys leaning against the post of the general store with their hats tilted against the sun, and 2 men standing slightly apart from the rest, one of them older, round-shouldered, with white hair and a kind face gone soft with age and something that looked like early-stage cataracts beginning to cloud his eyes. The other one was younger, lean and sun-dark, with a hat held in his hand instead of on his head, which she noticed because it was the kind of detail that told you something about a person. The stage stopped. The door opened. Matilda stepped down with her traveling bag and stood in the June sunlight of Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, and she looked at those 2 men. She had not known which one was which. She had no portrait of either of them. She had only the letters. She looked at the older man first. He had kind eyes, watery now from whatever was happening to his vision, and a warm expression, and he stepped forward with the careful movement of a man whose joints were giving him trouble. She knew immediately, without needing to be told, that this was Harlan Croft. Everything about him matched what Roy had described: the fair employer, the good man, the one with declining health he did not speak of. She looked at the younger one. He was looking at her. Not the way a man looks at a woman he is sizing up, but the way a person looks at someone they have been trying to picture for 3 months, and the picture was wrong in all the interesting ways. His eyes were dark brown, his face weathered in the way that years of outdoor work produced, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested the weathering had not all been hardship. He had the hands of a working man, she noticed, and he was turning his hat around and around by the brim the way people do when they are nervous and trying not to show it. She knew he was Roy Morgan before either of them said a word. And she understood, standing there in the dust with 3 days of travel behind her and the whole uncertain shape of her future in front of her, something that she had been half knowing for weeks. She had not come to Redemption Creek for Harlan Croft. She had come because a stranger had read her letter and written back, and somewhere in the exchange of all those pages she had stopped being practical and started being something else entirely. Harlan Croft stepped forward with his hand extended. "Miss Brooks," he said in a voice that was warm and genuine, "welcome to Redemption Creek. I am Harlan Croft. I am very glad you made the journey." She shook his hand and smiled at him, and it was a genuine smile because she could see immediately that he was exactly what Roy had said, a decent man, an honest one. "Mr. Croft," she said, "thank you for having me." Then Harlan turned and gestured toward the younger man. "This is Roy Morgan," he said. "He has been managing most of my correspondence these past months, as I expect he has told you." Roy Morgan stepped forward. He was not the man she had written to. He was the man who had written back. She had known that since the first letter. Standing here looking at him, she understood with the full weight of her whole body that that was better. That was considerably better. "Miss Brooks," he said. His voice was quieter than she had imagined, the Texas in it worn down to just a slight lengthening of certain vowels, a particular steadiness that matched the letters. "I am glad the stage was on time." "So am I," she said, and they both understood that she was not talking about the stage. Harlan watched this exchange with an expression that suggested he was not entirely without perception, despite his failing eyes. He cleared his throat gently and said, "We have a room arranged for you at Mrs. Haller's boarding house, Miss Brooks, for as long as you need to make your decision. There is no hurry." She thanked him and meant it, because his generosity in this situation was not something she took for granted. He had placed the advertisement, she had answered it, and here was this man standing between them like a gentle piece of weather, not a storm but not clear skies either. Mrs. Peavy materialized at Matilda's elbow as if she had been conjured. She was a small woman with bright eyes and a way of looking at a person that suggested she was already composing what she would say about them later. "Welcome to our little town," she said. "I am Alina Peavy. I run the general store. If you need anything, and I mean anything at all, you come to me." "Thank you, Mrs. Peavy," Matilda said. "Lovely to have a new face," Mrs. Peavy added, glancing between Matilda and Roy with the particular satisfaction of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at. "Roy, be a dear and help Miss Brooks with her trunk." Roy Morgan moved to do exactly that without needing any further prompting, and Matilda walked beside him toward the boarding house, their conversation finding its footing with the slightly awkward grace of two people who knew each other very well in one way and not at all in another. "You look different than I imagined," she said, which was honest if slightly unguarded. "How did you imagine me?" he asked. She considered that. "Older," she said. "I do not know why." "You look exactly as I thought you would," he said, and then seemed to realize how that might sound and added, "That was not meant to be odd. I only mean that you write the way you look, like someone who means what they say." She thought about that for a moment. "I will take that," she said. The first week in Redemption Creek was a careful, measured thing. Matilda spent time with Harlan Croft in the appropriate and formal way, taking meals at his house, walking the property, learning the shape of what he was offering. He was, as Roy had described, a genuinely good man. The ranch was well run, if showing signs of needing more attention than one man in declining health could give it. The house was large and quiet in the way of a house that had once held more people than it currently did. Harlan had been a widower for 8 years. His wife had been called June, and her absence was in the house the way a removed painting leaves a mark on the wall where it used to hang. He was honest with her about his health. Sitting on his porch on the third evening with the sun going orange over the hills, he said, "Miss Brooks, I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you are the kind of woman who appreciates that. My eyesight is going, as you have probably noticed. The doctor in Silver City says it will likely continue. I am not a young man, and I would not pretend otherwise. I need a partner, someone capable and steady, and what I can offer is security and a good life. I know that is not the same as offering romance." She looked at him with a respect she genuinely felt. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Croft," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with a small smile that crinkled the corners of his cloudy eyes, "Roy told me he wrote to you. He told me before I could find out any other way, which is the kind of man he is. He felt terrible about it." "He should not have," she said, before she could think better of it. Harlan looked at her with a directness that his failing vision did not diminish. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose he should not have." He paused. "He is a good man, better than he knows, which is also the kind of man he is." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and Harlan did not press her, and they sat in the comfortable silence of two honest people who understood each other without needing to say everything out loud. Roy was around the ranch most days, working. She saw him from a distance more than she spoke with him directly in those first days, because there was a propriety to observe, and also because she was not entirely sure what to do with herself when he was nearby. He had a way of being at ease with physical work that she found herself watching when she thought she was not being obvious about it. He was good with the horses, patient and consistent, and the other hands seemed to like him without apparent effort on his part. They spoke properly, at length, for the first time on the 5th day, when she went down to the corral in the late afternoon because she wanted to look at General, the bay gelding Roy had written about so specifically. He was there already, leaning on the top rail watching the horse move around the enclosure. "That is him," she said, coming to stand beside him. "That is him," Roy said. "He knows you are talking about him. Watch his ears." She watched. The horse's ears moved, one forward and one angled toward them in that complicated equine way of paying multiple kinds of attention at once. "He does have opinions," she said. "I told you." There was a moment of comfortable silence which felt remarkable given that they had known each other in person for less than a week. "I spoke with Harlan last night," she said. Roy kept his eyes on the horse. "He mentioned, he thinks very highly of you. The feeling is mutual." She looked at the side of his face, the clean line of his jaw, the way he kept his expression steady. "Roy," she said, and she had not called him that yet, and they both noticed it. "What are we doing?" He turned then and looked at her, and the directness of it was something she felt all the way through. "I think," he said slowly, "that we are trying to figure out how to be honest without being unfair to a man who deserves better than either of us being unfair to him." "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what we are doing." "I should not have written to you," he said. "Not the first letter. I knew when I was writing it that I should not. I wrote it anyway." "I am glad you did." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, and then he looked back at General, who had come to the fence rail and was investigating Roy's coat pocket with his nose. Roy pushed the horse's face away gently. "I have been thinking," he said, "that the right thing to do is to let you make your decision, whatever it is. That Harlan deserves your genuine consideration. That what I want is not the most important thing in this." "That is very noble of you," she said, and she did not say it sarcastically. She meant it. "It does not feel noble," he said. "It just feels right." She looked at General, who had given up on Roy's pocket and was now eyeing her with curiosity. She reached out slowly, letting the horse smell her hand first, and he did, and then she scratched his nose and he tolerated it with great dignity. "I'm going to talk to Harlan," she said. "Properly. Tomorrow." Roy nodded. He did not ask what she was going to say. She talked to Harlan the next morning at his kitchen table with coffee between them and the morning light coming in through the east window. She was as honest with him as she had been in every letter she had ever written, because she did not know how to be otherwise. She told him that she had come in good faith, that she had meant every word in her original letter, that she had great respect for him. And she told him, because he deserved the truth more than he deserved a comfortable lie, that something had happened in the course of those letters that she had not anticipated and could not pretend had not happened. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a while, looking at his coffee cup in that way of a man whose thoughts are running deeper than his expression lets on. Then he said, "Miss Brooks, can I tell you something?" "Of course," she said. "When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "I was looking for practical things. A capable woman, as it said. Someone to help manage what I can no longer manage alone. I did not expect anyone interesting to respond." He paused. "I mean that as a compliment. You were interesting. Your letter had a person in it, not just a resume of domestic skills. And when Roy told me he had written to you and looked at me the way he looked at me when he told me, I understood something that I should perhaps have understood earlier." She waited. "Roy has been on this ranch for 6 years," Harlan said. "I have never once seen him write a letter to anyone. Not once. He does not have people he writes to." He looked up at her. "I am old enough to know what it means when a man like that sits down and writes 5 pages to a woman he has never met." She felt her throat tighten with a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "He told me it was 5 pages," she said. "He told me it was 3, Harlan said, with a small smile. "Which means there were probably 7. He set his cup down. "I want to be clear with you about something. I am not a young man and my health is not improving. What I needed from an arrangement like this was, I will admit, more practical than romantic. I think I can solve my practical problems other ways. What Roy needs is something he cannot solve himself, and I think you understand that." She looked at this generous, clear-eyed old man, and she felt a wave of affection for him that was genuine and specific and not at all what she had expected to feel. "Harlan," she said, "you are one of the best men I have ever met." He laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That is very kind. I suspect it reflects well on your capacity for generosity more than my actual character." He pushed back from the table and stood carefully. "Now, I am going to go speak to my ranch hand, and I am going to tell him that the only thing worse than a man who takes what he wants without consideration is a man who wants something and is too stubborn to reach for it when he has been given leave to do so." Matilda smiled. "He is going to be embarrassed." "Tremendously," Harlan agreed. "It will do him good." She did not witness that conversation. She went to Mrs. Haller's boarding house and sat in her room and looked out the window at the hills and felt something inside her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as what it feels like when the direction of your life shifts, not violently but certainly, like a river finding the course it was always going to take. Roy came to the boarding house that evening. He knocked at the front door, and Mrs. Haller let him in and came to find Matilda with a look on her face that suggested she had already assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. Matilda came downstairs and found Roy standing in the parlor with his hat in his hands, which she was beginning to understand was what he did when he was feeling something he had not yet found words for. "Harlan spoke to you," she said. "He did," Roy said. "He is a remarkably difficult man to argue with. Did you try?" I pointed out that I was in no position to be courting the woman he had advertised for. "What did he say?" "He said I could find another way to describe it if it made me feel better, but that the basic fact of the situation was not going to change." She almost laughed and managed not to. "And what is the basic fact of the situation?" He looked at her, and there it was again, that directness, that steadiness that matched his letters so perfectly. "The basic fact," he said, "is that I wrote to you when I should not have, and you wrote back when you did not have to, and we have been writing to each other for 3 months, and I have been looking forward to those letters more than I have looked forward to anything in a considerable number of years. And you are standing in front of me right now, and I would like, if you are willing, to start figuring out what comes next." The parlor was quiet. Through the window came the distant sound of the town, a horse somewhere, a door closing, the faint music from the saloon down the street. "I am willing," Matilda said. What came next was a courtship, which in Redemption Creek in 1882 meant that people noticed it and formed opinions about it, and Mrs. Peavy tracked its progress with the dedication of a scientist observing a natural phenomenon. It meant Sunday afternoons walking along the river, which ran clear and cold along the southern edge of town, and had cottonwood trees along its banks that made a sound in the wind that Matilda found deeply beautiful. It meant evenings on Harlan's porch when the three of them sat together and Harlan read aloud from whatever book Roy had found him, because Harlan's eyes made reading himself increasingly difficult, and he loved books too much to stop altogether. It meant that Roy brought her General one morning, saddled and ready, and said, "You told me you could ride better than most men. I thought we could test that." And she had mounted with an efficiency that made Cobb and Fredericks both look up from what they were doing, and Roy had laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh, and she immediately understood that it was one of her favorite sounds. They rode out past the ranch into the hills that afternoon, the horses moving easily through the long grass, the mountains blue and far in the distance. She had not been on a horse since leaving Tucson, and the freedom of it opened something in her that had been closed down by months of worry and uncertainty. She let General move into a canter and felt the wind and looked over at Roy beside her on a gray mare he called Patience, and she thought, yes, this is what it is supposed to feel like. They stopped at the top of a ridge and looked out over the valley below. The ranch was a small square shape in the distance, the buildings pale against the dark green of the river trees. The afternoon was enormous and golden around them. "You were right about the sky," she said. "I told you," he said. "You cannot say I told you, you wrote it, it is different. Is it? Saying a thing out loud is a commitment, writing it is an offering." He was quiet for a moment, and she could tell he was turning that over. "That is true," he said. "I think I felt less exposed writing than I would saying it. You can control the page in a way you cannot control a conversation. You seem to do all right in conversation. You are easy to talk to," he said. "Not everyone is." She turned to look at him. The late sun was catching the side of his face, and there were the laugh lines she had noticed the first day and the steadiness that she kept coming back to. "Roy," she said, "tell me something you have never written in a letter." He thought about it. A good, genuine pause, the kind that meant he was taking the question seriously. "My oldest brother died on a cattle drive when I was 19, he said. "His name was Samuel. He was 23. There was a river crossing that went wrong, and I was there, and I could not get to him. He kept his eyes on the valley. I have never told anyone that, not in full." She did not say she was sorry, because she had learned that sorry was rarely the most useful thing. Instead she said, "What was he like?" And Roy told her about Samuel, who had been funny and reckless and impossibly good at roping, who had taught Roy to play cards and stolen the better horse when they were boys, and always been the first one out of bed in the morning. He talked about Samuel for a long time, and she listened, and the sun moved west and the horses stood quiet around them, and Matilda thought that this was what intimacy actually was, not proximity or prettiness, but the willingness to say the name of a grief out loud to someone who would hold it carefully. When he was done talking about Samuel, he looked at her and said, "Your turn." She told him about her father, not the logistics of his death, not the mortgage and the farm and the practical aftermath, but the person. Edmund Brooks, who had read to her every night until she was old enough to read herself and then read alongside her, who had told her, when she was 12, that she was the smartest person on the property, and she should never let anyone convince her that was a liability. Who had been proud of her in the uncomplicated, specific way that good parents are proud, which is to say for exactly who she was rather than who they wanted her to be. Roy listened the same way she had, with full attention and without offering anything unnecessary. When she was done, he said quietly, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," she said. They rode back down in the long evening light, and something had settled between them that felt different from anything before. Not more comfortable exactly, but more real. Less like a courtship in the formal sense, and more like two people who had decided to see each other clearly. July came hot and fast and full of activity. Matilda, who had been staying at Mrs. Haller's boarding house and helping out with light work at Harlan's ranch to earn her keep while she sorted out her situation, found that she had become part of the fabric of daily life in Redemption Creek in the way that capable, willing people always do. Mrs. Peavy put her to work helping with the store's accounts on Thursday mornings because, as Mrs. Peavy said without any particular delicacy, she needed someone who could see the numbers, and Matilda was clearly the most qualified person available. The town schoolteacher, a young woman named Frances Doyle who had come from Cincinnati 2 years prior and was still slightly surprised to find herself in New Mexico, befriended Matilda with an enthusiasm that was endearing in its forthrightness. Frances had strong opinions and a good laugh, and she made the adjustment to a new life considerably easier. Thomas wrote. His letters were shorter than hers, but they came, which was what mattered. He was working hard, he said, and eating well, and he had acquired a dog of questionable parentage that he had named General, which made Matilda laugh and write back telling him the name was already taken by a horse in New Mexico who would not appreciate the competition. Roy was there, and present, and increasingly something that she did not have a word for yet but was moving steadily toward one. They had an evening most weeks when they sat on the boarding house porch after supper, because Mrs. Haller was progressive enough to allow it and proprietary enough to leave the front door open, and they talked about books and about the territory and about things that had no particular category. He had brought her the battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets from the bunkhouse without making a production of it, just set it on the porch railing one evening and said, "You mentioned you had read everything on the farm shelf twice. You can have this one." She had looked at it, at the battered spine and the pencil notations in the margins that she would later discover were his. "You marked passages," she said. "The previous owner did," he said, looking away in a way that she had learned meant he was telling the truth at the same time as he was not. She read the notations over the following days. They were not extensive, just a word here and there, a line underlined, an occasional question mark beside something that had puzzled him. She read Sonnet 18 and found, beside the final couplet, in handwriting she now knew very well, "As long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." He had written, in small letters, "I had not thought about permanence like this before." She carried that with her for several days before she said anything about it. She brought it up one evening on the porch, the book on her knee. "You marked Sonnet 18, she said. He looked at her steadily. "The previous owner did," he said again. "The handwriting matches your letters," she said. A pause. "It might have been me," he allowed. "What did you mean when you wrote that you had not thought about permanence like that before?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat on his knee, the motion she had come to find deeply familiar. "I think I meant," he said slowly, "that when I read that poem I understood for the first time that words could make something last, that writing something down was a way of keeping it. And I did not have much in my life up to that point that I particularly wanted to keep." She looked at him. "I have more now," he said, and he did not elaborate, but he did not need to. The question of what came next was not unspoken between them. It was simply not yet articulated in the specific formal way that the time required. She was not going to stay at the boarding house indefinitely. The situation needed resolution. They both knew it. They talked around it the way honest people sometimes talk around the clearest truth, because the clearest truth requires the most courage. It was Harlan who precipitated things, as she had by that point come to expect. He came to find Roy one morning at the end of July, walking down to the corral with his cane and his careful steps, and he said, in front of Cobb and Fredericks and young Eli, who was no longer quite as homesick as he had been, that he was thinking about his will and he wanted to do it properly, and that involved certain conversations that could not be indefinitely delayed. Roy came to find Matilda that afternoon. She was in the boarding house garden, which she had taken over unofficially because Mrs. Haller's knees made kneeling difficult and the beds were going to seed. She was pulling weeds and she heard the gate and looked up, and he was there, standing inside the garden with his hat in his hand in the way she knew in the afternoon light, serious and quiet. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. She sat back on her heels and waited. He said, "I have been trying to find the right way to say something for approximately 6 weeks, which is a long time for a man who wrote 5 pages in one sitting." "7," she said. He blinked. "Harlan told you." He guessed. He said 3, and I worked out from there. A slight smile crossed his face and then steadied into something more earnest. He came forward and knelt down in the garden in front of her, which was somewhat impractical given that there was dirt, and it was not a small thing to kneel in one's good trousers, and she thought that was exactly the sort of thing she would remember about him, that he came to where she was instead of expecting her to come to where he was. "Matilda," he said. She had not grown tired of the way he said her name. She doubted she ever would. "I have been thinking about permanence," he said, and she caught the reference immediately and felt it in the center of her chest. "I think I would like to keep you, if that is something you are willing to be." She looked at this man who had read her letter 3 times when he should have put it down after one, who had written 7 pages and told Harlan it was 3, who had knelt in a garden in good trousers to say what he needed to say. "Roy Morgan," she said, "I came to Redemption Creek to meet a man I had written to. You were not that man." She paused. "You were the man who wrote back, and that has turned out to be better than anything I was looking for." He reached out and took her hand, which still had dirt on it, and he held it carefully. "Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said. They were married in September of 1882, in the white-steepled church that needed painting, but that was full of people who had decided they cared about this particular union, which is the best reason for a church to be full of anyone. Harlan Croft sat in the front pew on the right side, and he was not crying, technically, but his eyes were doing something that the lack of technical crying did not entirely explain. Mrs. Peavy sat 3 rows back and had already composed the version of events she would be telling for the rest of her life, which was accurate in all the important ways and embellished in only the most entertaining ones. Frances Doyle stood beside Matilda as her witness, in a dress she had ordered from a catalog, and which had arrived slightly wrong, but which she wore with the determined confidence of a woman from Cincinnati, who had made herself at home in New Mexico through sheer force of will. Cobb and Fredericks and young Eli sat together on the left side, cleaned up to varying degrees of success, and Thomas Brooks was there too, having traveled from outside Tucson on the stage, thinner and taller than 3 months ago, shaking Roy's hand with a grip that Roy matched, and held for an extra moment in the way that men sometimes communicate things that they are not saying. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Daniels, who had kind eyes and a tendency to run slightly long on readings but whose sincerity was never in question. When he came to the part where they said their own words, Roy had written his down. Matilda had not, because she thought she would feel what she needed to say when she got there. Roy read from the paper in his hand, and he did not look at the paper much because he mostly had it memorized. He said, "I did not go looking for you. You answered an advertisement that was not mine, and I wrote a letter I had no business writing, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I found out what I had been missing without knowing I was missing it. I am going to spend whatever time we have being honest with you and paying attention to you and making sure you always have books. That is my promise." Matilda looked at him and said, without notes, because she meant every word without preparation, "I came to Redemption Creek expecting to be practical. You made me brave instead. I do not know a better way to say it than that. I am going to love you for the rest of my life, and I am going to argue with you about Shakespeare, and I am going to ride general whenever I want because I am better at it than you are." Roy grinned. There was laughter in the church. Even Reverend Daniel smiled. The life they built in the years that followed was the kind that does not make particular headlines, but that is, in all the ways that matter, extraordinary in its daily fabric. Roy remained on Harlan's ranch and was eventually made foreman, a title that Harlan gave him with the same matter-of-fact directness with which Harlan did everything, by simply saying one morning, "You run this place better than I do." The title should match the reality. Roy accepted it with the quiet dignity that he brought to most things and did not make a fuss, which Harlan said was one more reason the title was appropriate. Matilda continued her work with the general store's accounts, which expanded over time because she was genuinely skilled at it, and Mrs. Peavy was not too proud to acknowledge a good thing when she had it. She also became, somewhat informally but very genuinely, a second resource for Francis Doyle's school, helping with the older children on reading and writing on Friday afternoons when the weather made outdoor work impractical. This was not an official position and was not paid as such, but it was real work that produced real results, and Matilda was the kind of person who valued those over titles. Thomas came for Christmas that first year, and the year after that, and by the third year he had decided more permanently to relocate to Redemption Creek. He was 20 by then, broad-shouldered and much steadier than the 16-year-old who had stood on the porch at their father's farm trying not to cry. He found work at the livery stable, and he had the same easy way with animals that Matilda had always had, and within a year he was managing a significant portion of its operations. He acquired more dogs. General the horse and General the dog never actually met, for reasons of geography, but Matilda found this quietly funny for years. Harlan's health continued its gradual decline through 1883 and into 1884. His sight was mostly gone by the spring of 1884, but he remained sharp in every other respect, and the evenings on his porch where he listened to Roy or Matilda read aloud continued without interruption. He had strong opinions about everything they read and he expressed them fully, and those evenings had become one of the things Matilda valued most about her life in ways she had not anticipated when she arrived in Redemption Creek looking for something practical. In the summer of 1883, Matilda discovered she was expecting a child. She told Roy on a Tuesday evening on their own porch, because they had a house now, a two-room house with a kitchen garden that she had expanded considerably from Mrs. Haller's original beds, on the edge of the ranch property where they could hear the horses in the morning. She had been holding the knowledge for 3 days because she wanted to be certain, and also because she was still getting used to the size of it. Roy did not say anything for a moment when she told him. He just looked at her with an expression that she had not seen from him before, something that was not quite any single thing but was composed of several, and then he set down what he had been holding and came to her and held her face in his hands and said, "Matilda," in the particular way he said her name when what he meant was everything. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am terrified," he said, "and I am so happy I do not have a word for it." Their son was born in February of 1884. He arrived on a cold night when the stars were sharp and close, and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Arroyo who had delivered half the babies in the valley, was matter-of-fact and reassuring throughout. Roy stayed as close as was permitted and possibly a few feet closer than was strictly appropriate. When it was over, and the midwife put the baby in Matilda's arms, and the child made the small outraged sound that all new people seem to make upon encountering the world, Roy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them with an expression that she would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. They named him Edmund Samuel Morgan, for her father and for Roy's brother, because they had decided early that names were a way of carrying people forward, and that both men deserved carrying. Edmund was called Ned almost immediately, because Edmund was a lot of name for a very small person, and Ned suited him better. He was large for his age and opinionated from the beginning, which Roy said he had entirely from his mother, and Matilda said came from nowhere in particular, and they argued about this pleasantly for years. Harlan met Ned when he was 3 weeks old, sitting in his chair with his eyes that could barely discern shapes anymore but his hands that were still sure and careful, and he held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had held babies before, and he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well, all right then." He passed away in the autumn of 1884, which was a grief that was real and specific, and not softened by its being anticipated. He had made his arrangements with the clear-eyed practicality that had characterized everything about him, and his will, when it was read by the lawyer from Silver City, left the ranch and its property to Roy Morgan and to Roy's wife Matilda, because, the will read in Harlan's precise dictation, Roy had been running the ranch well and faithfully for 8 years, and a man ought to own what he tends. Matilda sat in the lawyer's office and held Roy's hand and thought about the conversation she had had with Harlan in his kitchen on an early June morning, and she thought about how some people move through the world doing quiet good with such consistency that their full impact only becomes visible in retrospect. She thought that Harlan Croft was one of those people, and she was glad, deeply glad, that she had known him. The town of Redemption Creek knew about the will before the ink was dry on the legal documents, because Mrs. Peavy was very close friends with the lawyer's wife, and no one was particularly surprised. There was, for about 2 weeks, a neighbor named Gerald Prout who made some remarks at the saloon about the arrangements being irregular, but Gerald Prout was known to make remarks about things, and nobody took them seriously. And when Roy looked at him calmly across the bar one evening and said, "Harlan had the right to leave his property to whoever he chose, and I intend to honor what he built," Gerald Prout found that he did not have further remarks to make on the subject. They moved into Harlan's house in November of 1884, which was strange at first in the way that taking up residence in a place where a person you loved used to live is always strange. Matilda went through the house carefully, not erasing Harlan's presence but organizing it, keeping the things that should be kept and giving to people who would value them the things that should be passed on. She found in the study a stack of letters. Her letters, all of them. He had kept every letter she had written, bound together with a piece of rope, set in the drawer of his desk alongside a handful of other correspondence that was clearly important to him. She brought them to Roy and showed him. He looked at the stack of letters, at her handwriting on the envelopes, and he said nothing for a moment. Then, "He never told me he kept them." "He kept them," she said. Roy looked at the letters in her hands for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "that he was glad it happened the way it did, for his own reasons." "I think so too," she said. She put the letters in a box, along with the letters from Roy, all the ones she had received over those months of correspondence, and she kept that box on the shelf in the study for the rest of her life, because they were the story of how she got here, and the story of how a person gets to where they are supposed to be seemed like the kind of thing worth keeping. The ranch expanded modestly over the years, because Roy was careful and practical in business and Matilda was good with numbers, and their combined assessment of an idea was generally sound. They ran cattle and horses both, and the horse operation grew particularly because Roy's reputation with difficult animals was consistent, and people came from neighboring ranches and eventually from further afield to ask his opinion and sometimes to buy from him. Young Eli, who had been homesick when Matilda arrived, was still on the ranch by 1885, no longer young in the same way and no longer homesick. He had become one of Roy's most trusted hands. He had also, in the spring of 1885, married a woman from Redemption Creek named Clara Holt, no relation to the Mrs. Clara Holt of Tucson who had told Matilda once a week that a woman alone was a woman in trouble, but the coincidence of the name made Matilda smile whenever she thought of it. Eli was 22 and his wife Clara was 20, and they were the kind of young couple whose happiness is a slightly embarrassing thing to witness because it is so uncomplicated and complete. Frances Doyle, the schoolteacher from Cincinnati, left Redemption Creek in 1886 to marry a doctor in Albuquerque, which she had been corresponding with for 2 years via letters, and when she told Matilda she was leaving, she said, "You started this, with your story about the letters. It gave me ideas." "I did not start anything," Matilda said. "You absolutely started it," Frances said. "You turned up here having been courted entirely by post and married the wrong man's ranch hand, and it was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. I decided I would try the same thing. I did not court Roy by post. He intercepted my correspondence." "Even better," Frances said, with the wide smile that was one of the things Matilda would miss most. They embraced at the stage, and Matilda did not cry because she was not someone who cried easily in public, but she held Frances for an extra moment before she let go. Thomas found his footing in Redemption Creek with a thoroughness that sometimes made Matilda wonder if this had always been where he was supposed to be, if their father's death and the sold farm had simply cleared the way for something that was already determined. He was good at the work, well-liked, and he had, by 1886, his own name for himself in the valley as someone who understood horses with an instinct that was not entirely learned. Roy worked with him often and valued him, which mattered to Matilda in ways she did not always articulate but which Roy understood without needing to have them spelled out. In 1887, a second child arrived. This time it was a girl, delivered on a warm May morning with considerably less drama than Ned's winter arrival. They named her June, after Harlan's wife, which felt right in a way that both Roy and Matilda understood without discussing it extensively. June was very different from Ned from the beginning, quieter and more observant, watching everything with dark eyes that were distinctly her father's, and a patience that Matilda recognized as something that had come from Roy's most fundamental nature. Ned, by this time 3 years old and in full possession of his considerable personality, regarded his sister with initial suspicion that gave way within a week to a proprietary affection that expressed itself by sitting next to her as much as possible and reporting everything she did to whichever adult was nearest. Roy found this deeply amusing. Matilda found it deeply familiar and told Roy that Thomas had done the exact same thing to her when she was young. There were complications in those years, as there are in any real life, because the Wild West in the 1880s was not a gentle era, and the territory of New Mexico was still a place where things could go wrong without much warning. There were hard winters, a drought in the summer of 1886 that made water management a daily preoccupation, a dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line that required a trip to the county seat, and a lawyer and several months of strained relations before it resolved. There was an outbreak of something at the ranch in the autumn of 1885 that took 2 of the horses and could have been worse, and would have been worse without Roy's quick response and Matilda's insistence on sending for the veterinarian from Silver City rather than waiting. And there was, in 1888, a harder thing. A young man on the ranch knew that year, who got into an altercation in town one night and was badly hurt, and who died 3 days later. He was 20 years old. His name was Peter Clay, from somewhere in East Texas, and he had been on the ranch less than 6 months. Roy drove himself very hard in the days after that, working later and starting earlier, and Matilda let him do it for the first few days because she understood that some grief had to be worked through physically before it could be spoken. Then on the 4th evening she sat down beside him on the porch and said, "Tell me about Peter." He looked at her. And then he talked about Peter Clay, about the particular way he had of laughing at himself, about the horse he was learning to ride that summer, about the letter he had shown Roy once from his mother, proud and embarrassing in equal measure. The kind of letter a mother writes to her grown son when she forgets for a moment that he does not need protecting anymore. Matilda listened and held his hand, and this was the thing she had come to understand most fully about loving Roy Morgan. It was not the grand moments, not the courtship and the letters and the day in the church, though those mattered. It was this, being present for the weight of things. Staying in the room when the room was hard to be in. "I keep thinking," Roy said, "that there should be something I could have done." "There probably was not," she said. "No," he said, "probably not, but I keep thinking it anyway." "That is not a flaw," she said. "That is what it looks like to take people seriously." He looked at her in the porch dark. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Say the exact right thing." She shook her head. "I do not always. You remember the times I do." "Maybe that is what love is," he said, "remembering the times." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time while the stars came out, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, and the creek murmured its endless conversation in the distance. A second son arrived in 1890, when Ned was 6 and June was 3, and the ranch was running well, and the house felt, as Matilda told Roy in a letter she wrote to him once when he was away on business in Santa Fe, like it had been always waiting to be full of exactly these people. The new baby was a boy, red-faced and loud and extremely definite about his preferences from the first hour, which Matilda said was entirely Roy, and Roy said was absolutely the Brooks temperament, and Ned observed, from his position as eldest, that the baby was very loud, and would he be this loud for long? He was loud, it turned out, for several years. They named him Harlan because it was time, and because the name had been sitting unused in the house since 1884, and it deserved to be spoken again out loud in rooms where it would be answered. Little Harlan, called Hal almost immediately by his brother, was 3 weeks old when Matilda sat in the study late one evening, the house quiet around her, the box of letters on the shelf in front of her. She took them out, all of them, and she spread them on the desk and looked at the progression of the handwriting, at her own letters and Roy's, at the way the early ones were careful and formal, and the later ones were something else entirely, easier and more themselves. She found the first letter. The one Roy had written instead of Harlan Croft. She read it again, for the first time in years. "Miss Brooks, I must confess something to you before we go any further." She sat with it in the lamplight, the house around her breathing with the sleep of her family, and she felt the full sweep of what had happened since a postal rider came to her father's porch with an envelope she had been waiting for, and found something she had not been expecting at all. She was 32 years old. She had 3 children and a house that was hers, and a life that was real in all its ordinary and extraordinary particulars. She had come to Redemption Creek looking for security and found love, which she had not let herself admit she was looking for. She had written to a man who needed a capable woman and been answered by a man who recognized her and was not afraid of what he saw. Roy appeared in the doorway barefoot, in the way he got up when he heard the baby or heard her moving around late. He looked at the letters on the desk, at her face. "Trouble sleeping," he said. "No," she said. "Just thinking." He came in and sat on the edge of the desk the way he always sat when he came to find her in the study, one leg up and the other on the floor. He looked at the spread of letters. "Anything specific?" She handed him the first letter, the one he had written. He took it and looked at it, and she watched his face as he read it, the slight softening around his eyes that she had learned to read as the external sign of an internal shift. He read it through to the end, including the postscript. Then he set it down on the desk. 7 pages, she said. 6.5, he said. She laughed, full and genuine, and the sound of it moved through the quiet house. He smiled at her, the smile that had come later than the laugh and that she therefore treasured slightly more, and he reached across the desk and took her hand. "I should not have written it," he said. "Roy, I know," he said. "I know. I am glad I did. I was just thinking about whether a man should be glad about doing something he should not have done. I think," she said, "when the consequence of the wrong action is this, you are allowed to be glad about it." He turned her hand over in both of his, looking at it with the expression she recognized as the one that preceded saying something he had thought about but not yet said aloud. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. When I wrote that letter, I did not know what I was doing. I truly did not. I sat down and I wrote it because your words were in my head and I could not put them down, and I thought I would write the letter and then not send it, or I would write it and send it and you would never respond and that would be the end of it." He looked at her. "I have thought many times about what would have happened if you had not written back, if you had been cross, as you said, if you had written only to Harlan and disregarded me entirely." "I almost did," she said honestly. "I know." "I sat with it for a full day," she said. "I almost did not answer you." "What made you?" She thought about it. She had thought about it before, across the years, had turned it over the way you turn over the significant moments, looking for what they were made of. "You said you would answer honestly," she said. "And I thought, what would it cost me to ask one honest question and receive one honest answer? And I could not find an answer to that question that was large enough to stop me." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am glad," he said, "that the cost seemed small enough." She stood up from the desk and moved around it, and he slid off the edge and stood up to meet her, and she put her hands on either side of his face. This face she knew so well and still found, every day, worth looking at. "Roy Morgan," she said, "you were not the man I wrote to." "No," he said. "You were the man who wrote back," she said. "Yes. And that," she said, "was better. It is still better. It will keep being better." He kissed her there in the study with the letters spread on the desk, and the lamp burning low, and 3 sleeping children somewhere in the house. And it was neither more nor less romantic than everything else they had been through together. Which is to say, it was exactly right. Which is all any love story is actually trying to say. The years that followed built themselves in the way good years do, brick by brick, with the work and the seasons and the accumulation of small moments that are the actual substance of a life. Ned grew into a boy who was like his mother in his directness and his stubbornness and his way of reading everything he could get his hands on, and like his father in a certain steadiness that emerged when things got difficult, the ability to assess a situation and remain useful. By the time he was 10, he was a competent rider. By 12, he was helping with the younger horses under Roy's supervision, and Roy taught him with the same patience he brought to the animals themselves, consistent and specific. June was quieter than her brother, but in no way smaller. She watched the way Roy watched, collecting information before she acted on it, and she had a gift for drawing that revealed itself around age 7, and which Matilda encouraged with a commitment that surprised even herself. She ordered drawing paper from the catalog in Santa Fe, and June filled it systematically. Careful portraits of the horses and the ranch buildings and the people around her, and several of the portraits were good enough, by the time she was 12, that Roy framed them and put them on the study wall without making a ceremony of it, just put them up where they could be seen. Hal was, as predicted, loudly himself for many years, and then around age 7, he went through a quiet period that lasted about 2 weeks and worried everyone, and then he came out the other side with the same energy but more directed, as if he had sorted something out internally and was ready to apply it. He became devoted to Thomas in the way that certain children become devoted to an uncle who has time for them, and Thomas, who had no children of his own but a great deal of warmth and several dogs, was an excellent uncle in every practical measure. The town of Redemption Creek grew slowly through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, as the territory continued its gradual shift towards statehood that would not come fully until 1912, but whose implications were felt long before. New families arrived, new businesses, a new schoolhouse that was larger than the original and that Matilda had been involved in organizing, because she had been involved in the school since Francis Doyle's time and saw no reason to stop. A telegraph office opened in 1889, which changed the rhythm of communication in ways that Matilda observed with a particular and private appreciation, because she understood, perhaps better than most people in Redemption Creek, what it meant to send words to someone far away and wait for them to come back. She wrote to Thomas's son eventually, when Thomas finally married in 1893, a woman named Ruth from a family that had been in the territory for 20 years. They had a boy in 1895, and Matilda wrote to Ruth the way her neighbor Mrs. Holt had never written to her, with practical information and genuine warmth, and none of the warning that a woman alone was a woman in trouble, because she had found that unnecessary and unhelpful both. Roy, in his late 40s, was still lean and sun-dark, and still turned his hat in his hands when he was feeling something he had not found words for yet. She had never grown tired of that. She did not expect she would. He had gray at his temples by 1898, and the laugh lines were deeper, and the hands were more scarred from years of work. And she loved all of it with the specific affection of a person who has watched something or someone become more themselves over time. They had, over the years, established the habit of writing each other letters on their anniversary, not because they needed to, not because there was anything left to say that could not be said in person, but because it was where they had started, and it seemed right to keep the habit. Roy wrote hers by hand in the study late at night, and left it on the kitchen table where she would find it in the morning. She wrote his on the afternoons when he was out with the cattle and left it on his pillow. They did not read them aloud to each other. They did not discuss them afterward. They were private things, honest things, and they went into the box on the study shelf with all the others, the record of what they had been to each other and what they had become. On their 15th anniversary in September of 1897, Roy's letter read, in the slanted handwriting she had first seen on a porch in Tucson, "Matilda, I have been trying for 15 years to find the word for what you are to me. I have looked in the Shakespeare and in every other book we have on the shelf. I have not found it. I think it might be that the word does not exist yet, that it is still being assembled from everything we have been to each other, from the letters and the river in general, and the children and the porch evenings, and every morning I have gotten up knowing you were in this house. When I find the word I will write it down immediately. Until then, Roy." She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee growing cold beside her, and she held it for a long time, and then she put it in the box with the others. Her letter to him that year read, "Roy, you are the man who wrote back. In 15 years that has only become more true. Matilda." Ned left for university in 1902, which was a complicated pride, watching your firstborn go east on the stage the way you had once gone west on one. He was studying law, which made sense to both Roy and Matilda in the way that makes sense when you know a person well, because Ned had always cared deeply about what was right, and had a particular tolerance for sitting with difficult questions and working through them carefully. June, by that time 18 and clear-eyed and her own person in every sense, had begun to sell her drawings to a newspaper in Santa Fe, which had wanted illustrations for the territory articles, and this had expanded into a correspondence with an editor there who was interested in her work. She had not left yet, but she would, and Matilda had made her peace with that because she was the daughter of a woman who had gotten on a stagecoach to a new place in 1882, and she could not in good conscience suggest that was not a reasonable thing to do. Hal, at 12, was already trying to argue that he should be allowed to accompany the cattle drives, which Roy handled with the combination of firm and patient that was Roy's particular gift, and Matilda handled by reminding Hal that she could ride better than most men she knew and had still waited until she was a grown adult to make the large decisions. And Hal grumbled about this with the specific grumbling of a youngest child who knows the argument is good and does not appreciate it. The house was full and then less full, and then full again in the way of houses where real life happens. It had the horses and the creek, and the study with the letters on the shelf, and the portraits June had drawn framed on the walls, and the kitchen table where most of the important conversations had taken place. It had the porch where Matilda sat most mornings with her coffee before anyone else was properly awake, looking out at the hills going pink with the early sun, and where Roy most often found her and sat down beside her without needing to say anything. There was a morning in the autumn of 1903, cool and clear, the light particular and golden the way October light in New Mexico has always been, when Matilda sat on the porch with her coffee and Roy came out and sat beside her, and they watched the hills come into the morning in the way they had watched them for 21 years. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That this is exactly what I hoped for," she said, "when I was practical about it, before I let myself be anything other than practical." He looked at her. "What did practical you hope for?" "A good life," she said, "security, something steady, and—" She considered the question with the honesty she had always tried to bring to everything. "And I got something considerably louder and more complicated and more wonderful than any version of steady I could have planned for," she said. He smiled. It was the smile that had come later than the laugh, the one she treasured slightly more. "I got something I was not looking for at all," he said. "Was that all right?" she said, with the slight warmth of an old joke between them. "That was the best thing," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the morning came in over the hills, gold and enormous and certain. The way mornings in New Mexico come in when the season is turning, and the world is doing what it was always going to do, and the two of them sat with their coffee and their long life together, and they were, in the full and specific and unrepeatable way, exactly where they were supposed to be. The letters stayed in the box on the study shelf. All of them, from the first impossible one to the anniversary ones, from the careful formal ones of early courtship to the later ones that needed very few words, because they were written by people who understood each other in the particular way that only time and honesty and choosing each other over and over again can build. And if you opened that box, which no one did but Matilda, on the mornings when she wanted to remember the shape of how she had arrived here, and you read from the beginning, you would find the record of a woman who had been practical and steady and had stepped forward into a life she had not planned. And you would find the record of a man who had read a letter he should not have read and written a letter he should not have written, and in doing so had changed the direction of everything for both of them. He was not the man she had written to. He was the man who had written back, and that, as she had told him on the porch and in the study and in every anniversary letter she had ever written, and as she went on knowing for every year they had remaining to them, which were many and good and full, was better. It was so much better, it was the best thing,